Hey guys, so today we'll be going over the personality chapter, and I'm actually in Dr. Lawrence's personality class right now at Baylor, and I'm in the Honors College, as some of you might know, and so through that we have to contract a certain number of our regular classes for honors credit, and I had chosen to do that with Dr. Lawrence's personality class this semester, and so I was actually supposed to be coming into all of y'all's classes and actually giving the personality lecture myself in place of Dr. Lawrence as a way to fulfill my honors contract for her personality class. So what you'll see is later this week on her Canvas pages and on Dr. Wisely's will be an extra review video for Chapter 14, Personality. I'm going to focus mostly on sort of the Freud stuff, so when we get to some of that today, I'll skip over a little bit of it, but just know to be looking for that, and I'll probably do something to give you an SI credit for watching that video and filling out a little reflection or something like that, so just be aware that that's coming. Here are the answers to the warm-up you should have done. Here's some explanation on why these answers were the correct ones. And then do remember that compassionate love is often an option choice or an answer choice on the exams, but it's never going to be the correct answer. Compassionate love is not something we talk about in an intro. So remember that it's companionate that we're looking at. Okay. So in this chapter, it's a lot about Freud and sort of his psychoanalysis, but we have to start off with this idea of psychodynamic theories. So remember that psychodynamic theories emphasize the unconscious mind and the importance of your childhood experiences on your development and your personality. So then what you want to know on top of that is Freud championed the psychoanalysis movement, which is a branch of psychodynamic. So psychoanalysis is a type of psychodynamic, but there are many other types of psychodynamic besides psychoanalysis. So just be aware of how those two relate, but just know that psychodynamic is the overarching category, psychoanalytic is a type of psychodynamic practice. And so psychoanalysis is all about the Freud stuff. So this is about those unconscious motives and conflicts, defense mechanisms, psychosexual stages we'll talk about in just a minute, and id, ego, and superego. So psychoanalysis is all Freud's techniques used to treat psychological disorders and explore personality. The unconscious mind, according to Freud, is a reservoir of mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. Things that are disturbing to us, things that we sort of banish to a place where we don't think about them. So for Freud, the unconscious is a very negative thing. It has to do with all of these sort of very animalistic kind of drives and urges and tendencies to just go for whatever feels good and not really weigh costs and benefits too much. So just kind of know that the unconscious for Freud has a negative connotation. But when it comes to contemporary psychologists, when we're talking about the unconscious, we're just talking about processing of information that we're unaware of. It doesn't have a negative connotation. Free association was one of Freud's techniques, I suppose, for getting people to reveal intimate aspects of their personality. And so what he'd do is you would just lay down on a sofa and he would say, okay, I'm going to say a word, and as soon as I say this word, I want you to respond with the first thing that comes to your mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing or whatever it may be. So they're asking you really to stop self-monitoring and trying to control your thoughts and feelings and to just say whatever comes to mind. And that's the idea behind free association, that whatever you say in response indicates something about your unconscious mind's processing. Okay, and then id, ego, and superego are a really important Freudian concept. So Freud says our personality is divided into these three components. And the first component is id, which stands for internal desire. So the id has to do with satisfying your basic sexual and aggressive drives. It operates on the pleasure principle, and it wants immediate gratification. So this is just that part of you that wants and desires different things. So write that down. The id is for wants and desires. The id functions for wants and desires. No self-control, just wants and desires. And then the ego is going to be the executive part of personality that mediates the three. And so this operates on the reality principle, so it wants to satisfy your desires, but in a realistic way that's going to bring you long-term pleasure instead of pain. So let's use an example. You go into a store and you see this shirt that you love, but it's too expensive to buy, right? So your id wants it. Your id wants that shirt. But your ego is going to step in and say, well, look, if I actually steal this shirt and I get caught, that's going to be a big consequence, right? I'm going to be arrested or fined, or it's going to go on my record, something like that. So your ego is what steps in and sort of pulls back on the id and says, hang on, wait a minute, because this doesn't really make a lot of logical sense. We need to weigh our pros and cons, costs and benefits, and see what is the most realistic way to bring about that pleasure that the id wants, instead of just following every whim and desire and ending up in a worse place. So next to ego, I want you to write down logical reasoning. The ego is for logical reasoning, weighing pros and cons, things like that. Logical reasoning. And then your superego, next to that, write down moral reasoning. Your superego is your morality. And so this internalizes your ideals and provides sort of a conscience for things. So still using that same example of, wanting a shirt that's too expensive to buy. Your id says, take it, I want it. It doesn't matter, I need to have it. And then your ego comes in and says, well, I don't know if we should do that, because if you get caught, we could really have some bad consequences. But your superego is the one that comes in and says, well, hang on, that doesn't even matter, because stealing is wrong. So you shouldn't do it because stealing is wrong, right? So your superego is your morality part. So understand how these three operate separately. The id says, this is what I want, therefore I want to just take it. And then your ego says, well, wait a minute, pros and cons, what's going to bring about pleasure or pain? And then superego comes in and says, well, forget about all that. What's right and wrong? What's the right thing to do? What's the wrong thing to do? And follow your conscience. And so it's all kind of about the way that we balance these. That has to do with differing personality structures between people. Okay, so the psychosexual stages, and this is the part that I'm mostly going to focus on in that additional lecture that I'll be giving, but really all you need to know specifically on this is just the order. The order and sort of kind of what they're related to, although, oral goes with the mouth. Wow, what a surprise, right? Anal has to do with bowel and bladder elimination. So it's pretty easy to tell what these things go with, although those last three can be a little bit more difficult. But just be aware of what these stages are and what their focus is. You don't have to know too much detail or anything like that. But the idea is that if you suffer some kind of struggle or trauma or something that's anxiety arousing during one of these stages, you can become fixated in that stage. So let's talk about kind of fixation and all of these different ideas. So an Oedipus complex. This is so funny. According to Freud, this is when a boy has a sexual desire towards his mother, and so he feels jealous and hates his father because his father is like a competitor for his mother's love. Of course, we haven't found any evidence for this, but this was just something that Freud thought was true and thought that happened in the phallic stage, which is 3 to 6 years old. And then there's a parallel for girls called the Electra complex, which is just the exact opposite. The idea that a girl has sexual desires towards her father, and so she's competing with her mother for his affection. And this creates frustration, during this stage. And then identification is kind of just how you're going to build your superego, how you build your conscience. Identification is essentially identifying values of your parents as you're growing up and then incorporating those values into your conscience. So this is how you build your superego. And then fixation, this is kind of the main part of understanding for the psychosexual stages. So like I said, if you experience some kind of trauma or difficulty or frustration during one of these stages, you can become fixated on it. And fixated just means that in order to sort of relieve that anxiety that you have about something uncomfortable, you retreat to an anxiety coping mechanism of an earlier stage. So let's say that during the oral stage, 0 to 18 months, something really horrible happened to a child, and then later on in life, they started smoking. That would be something that Freud would say is an oral fixation. Smoking, excessively chewing gum, just anything that kind of has to do, excessive eating even could be considered an oral fixation. Anything that has to do with the mouth region and pleasure, right? And then, fixation in the anal stage could have to do with like constipation or something like that. So just understand that basically Freud, what he says is if something bad happens in one of these stages, then you have a fixation on that stage, and later on in your life, you develop tendencies that help you cope with that previous anxiety, right? Okay. And then you're going to want to know these defense mechanisms pretty inside and out, basically. But a defense mechanism is just a way that we defend ourselves against anxiety, right? It's the way that we reduce anxiety, the way we make ourselves feel better. And Freud says that the one that underlies all of these is repression. Repression underlies all defense mechanisms. And repression, again, is that idea that if something bothers us, we want to banish it to our unconscious mind and never think about it again. We don't want to address it. We want to repress or hide, cover, push away those anxiety-producing feelings. So repression is the one that underlies all of them. So then you've got regression. So this is when you're faced with something anxiety-producing, and to deal with that anxiety, you go back to an earlier psychosexual stage. So an example would be a little boy is on his way to his first day of school, and he's nervous, so he starts sucking his thumb. Thumb sucking would be something that should have ceased by about 1.5 years of age of the child. And so when a 4 or 5-year-old is going to school for the first time and they start sucking their thumb, they've regressed or retreated back to an earlier practice to reduce anxiety. Reaction formation is switching your unacceptable emotions or impulses into their opposites. So if you're feeling angry, you might be super exaggeratingly friendly that day instead, right? To not show your true feelings of anger. Projection is when your own attributes you put on someone else. So if you're late, if you're a late person all the time, right? And then every single time any one of your coworkers is late, you notice it immediately and you're like, oh, they're so irresponsible. What a late person, right? But you don't notice it in yourself. That would be projection. So an example is the thief that thinks everyone else is a thief. So because I'm a thief and I engage in thief behavior, I distrust everybody else because I assume they're going to do the same thing to me. It's kind of like that. Projection really is just taking any attribute that you have and assuming that someone else has that same attribute too. And often it comes with not recognizing that you have the attribute yourself. Rationalization, we all do this. I dare you to go a day without rationalizing something. But this is just a self-justifying explanation. This is like, if you cheated on a test or something like that, like cheating's wrong, but you're like, man, this grade is so important to me and I need to get into grad school, and so just this once it's okay. That kind of self-justifying explanation, just this once it's okay kind of a thing, is rationalization. So this example would be a habitual drinker who says she only drinks with her friends just to be sociable, but it's clearly more of a problem than that. Displacement is the way I want you to think about displacement is like this. When you can't take your aggression out on the thing that's making you mad, you shift that aggression towards something that can't fight back. Something that can't fight back. So the example here is a little girl is mad at her mom because her mom put her in a timeout, and so she kicks the family dog. So understand how her aggression was directed towards her mom for putting her in a timeout, but she knows she can't go kick her mom. So instead, she puts that aggressive urge towards something that cannot fight back, the dog, right? Another example will be punching a wall, right? So it's just anytime you put your aggression on something that is less threatening than you and that can't really fight back. And then denial is just the refusal to believe that something is true at all. So someone shows you evidence that your partner's cheating and you're like, nope, that must be doctored. It can't possibly be true. This isn't happening, right? So denial is just completely dismissing the fact that it could even be true. So again, have a pretty good idea of all of these because it's very, very, very common for her to just give one of these examples essentially and say, which defense mechanism does this describe? Okay, so now I want to talk about what of Freud's ideas were accepted and which ones ultimately were sort of rejected by research. And this also kind of tells you the difference between psychodynamic theory and psychoanalytic theory, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. So Freud's supporters and pioneering psychoanalysts are called Neo-Freudians. And Neo-Freudians accepted Freud's basic ideas. So they accepted the id, the ego, the superego, the importance of the unconscious mind, the fact that personality roots in your childhood experiences, and also these anxiety and defense mechanisms. And they adopted his interviewing techniques. So the basic ideas and the interviewing techniques were kept. But what they disagreed with was the Neo-Freudians put a lot more emphasis on the conscious mind's role in interpreting experiences and coping with the environment. So remember again that Freud basically ignored any use of the unconscious mind apart from just banishing these unacceptable thoughts. So again, Freud had this really negative connotation with the unconscious mind, whereas Neo-Freudians are saying, well, the unconscious mind isn't the only thing that's important here. We have to think about the conscious mind too, because Freud really kind of just ignored the conscious mind and said, I don't care how they think they feel. I want to know what's in their unconscious mind. I want to know what's in those deep, dark depths that they don't want to address, you know? And so Neo-Freudians are saying, well, we still need the conscious mind because we got to interpret experiences and cope with the environment, and that certainly has got to have an effect on personality too. And then they also doubted that this idea that Freud had that sex and aggression were these all-consuming motivations that directed everything we ever did. They rejected that. They were like, no, sex and aggression are important, but we also have other motives and our social interactions are hugely important as well. And then the inferiority complex is another Neo-Freudian theory that our behavior is driven by our efforts to kind of push down childhood inferiority feelings that trigger our strivings for superiority and power. So if in our childhood we felt powerless and inferior, then that sort of leads us to strive for superiority and power later in life. And then the collective unconscious. This is sort of a weird concept for a lot of people to understand, so I'm going to try to kind of make it as simple as I can. But this is Carl Jung's idea that all humans have some kind of reservoir of memory traces from throughout our species' history. That sounds a little ridiculous because you're like, obviously, like, you aren't born holding other people's memories. And that's true. However, there's actually some pretty good evidence for the collective unconscious, at least in that those memory traces that get passed down through a species, when they relate to fear or threats, those types of memory traces are more supported. So again, this isn't going to make a lot of sense until I give you an example, so let's just move to that. But if you raised a bunch of chickens in isolation, right? So they'd never experienced a threat of a predator. They'd never seen, a bird or a snake or anything like that before, besides their own species. So if you raise a bunch of chickens in isolation and they're running around doing their chicken thing, right? And you put like the shape of an eagle above them so that the shadow of the eagle shines down, it would make me sense as a shadow. So the shadow of the eagle projects down to the ground. And all of those chickens, the moment they see that shadow, are going to run away. Why? Right? There's no reason that they should fear an eagle. They've never been exposed to one before. But throughout, the species history, an eagle has been a threat, perhaps, to chickens. And so it's something that triggers this sort of innate survival reflex or response. Another example would be, I don't know if you've ever watched those videos of people putting cucumbers behind cats and then they turn around and they jump up like 20 feet in the air. So those are kind of like another example of collective unconscious as well. For what reason would a cat be afraid of a cucumber? It doesn't make any sense, right? Well, the idea is that the cucumber actually resembles a snake. But again, my cats are, house cats. They've never seen a snake in their whole lives. And yet, if I do that cucumber trick and I put it behind them, they'll jump up and freak out too, And so this is kind of evidence for that collective unconscious idea that just the fact that animals and people can be fearful or cautious around things that they've never learned to fear. It's just sort of a natural built-in fear that we have. Okay, and then we've got projective tests. And so this is the main test used in psychoanalysis, psychodynamic theory, really, on the whole. But so there's the thematic apperception test and the Rorschach inkblot test. I think the best way to go about explaining these is really just to show you pictures. So this would be the thematic apperception test, and the idea here is that these images are supposed to be ambiguous. It's not clear what's happening. And you would give these photos to a person and you'd ask them to tell you a story about that scene. And the idea is that whatever story they concoct or whatever emotions they see in those people's faces tells you something about their unconscious mind, right? So if you frequently see anger in faces where other people are often seeing, sadness or something like that, that could suggest that you had like an abusive childhood or something like that to make you more attuned to anger in faces, right? So that's the thematic apperception test, is just like an ambiguous image and you explain what's happening if it were a story. And then the Rorschach inkblot test, you've probably seen things like this before. It's just a random blot of ink and you're supposed to describe what you see. So like for this top one, for example, someone could say, oh, I see a butterfly that's, flapping its wings downwards, about to move up. Or someone could say, I see a bat, right? So kind of that difference in whether you're seeing generally positive versus generally negative things can reveal something about your unconscious. Or if every single one of these ink blots looks like a train to you, for example, maybe there's something going on with someone in your family killed by a train, or, that's kind of the process that psychoanalysts are going through when they're giving these tests out to people. Okay. So today we have contradicted most of Freud's ideas, but here's kind of what the modern research says. Today's developmental psychologists see our development as lifelong, not fixed in childhood. So Freud was really focusing on those childhood experiences and saying this determines every aspect of your personality. But now people, especially developmental psychologists, are going to say, no, your personality continues to develop all the way into your adult life. It's not like you just stop developing your personality at, 8, 10, 12 years old, right? Some think that Freud overestimated your parental influence and underestimated your peer influence. So in other words, overestimated the impact that your parents and their parenting has on your personality development, and underestimated your interactions with your friends on your personality development. Researchers find very little support for defense mechanisms, disguising sexual and aggressive impulses. And the most serious problem with Freud's theory is that it offers an after-the-fact explanation, but it fails to predict behaviors and traits. So let's talk about that for a second. If we were thinking about those psychosexual stages, for example, Freud would say, if something really bad happened to you during the oral stage, you're going to develop an oral fixation. So anyone who is a smoker, he would say, had an oral fixation. So that's an after-the-fact explanation. You smoke? Then something bad must have happened to you between the ages of 0 and 18 months because you have an oral fixation, right? But it fails to predict behaviors and traits. So when we look at children who have had some kind of trauma or issue within the oral stage, for sure, not all of them end up becoming smokers or becoming orally fixated in other ways, chewing gum excessively or, what have you. So that's really the most serious problem, is that Freud kind of looks at it after the fact and says, this means that something must have happened earlier in your childhood, but of course you don't remember it because you were too young, so, you can't disprove that that's the case, right? But it does not predict behaviors and traits. And then repression is also something that has been challenged and contradicted a lot. So psychoanalytic theory hinges on that assumption that our mind is going to repress things that are offensive or anxiety producing. But today's research shows that repression, if it even occurs, is rarely a mental response to trauma. And what we actually see is that what's much more common is that those memories that are anxiety or stress producing end up being memories that are really well lodged in our mind, not memories that we forget about. They typically become flashbulb memories in the amygdala. So in general, people who have had something really traumatic happen to them tend to have a harder time forgetting it. They lock it into their minds actually more aggressively. And repression is actually pretty uncommon, we've seen. Okay, so like I said, Freud was really stuck in the unconscious, just being about those negative things that we don't want to think about. But when it comes to modern researchers, they're saying the unconscious has so much more to do with our functioning than just being a sort of this reservoir of negative thoughts and emotions. So to modern researchers, the unconscious involves your schemas, and those are going to automatically control your perceptions and your interpretations. That's a pretty big function of the unconscious mind. The fact that priming exists, the fact that we can be primed by stimuli that we aren't consciously aware of, is pretty good evidence for the fact that the unconscious mind is responsible for more than just holding negative thoughts and emotions. Right hemisphere activity that enables a split brain patient's left hand to carry out an instruction they can't verbalize, right? So that disconnect between mind and body is another evidence of the unconscious. Implicit memories, instantly activated emotions, stereotypes and implicit prejudice. These are all things that the unconscious mind is involved in, activities of the unconscious mind. And research does support two of Freud's defense mechanisms: reaction formation and projection. Those are the only two that we found evidence for. Although I think that's so strange because rationalization is so obviously common between people, but I don't know why we haven't been able to find consistent evidence on that. And then research also supports Freud's idea that we unconsciously defend ourselves against anxiety. So the idea that we have defense mechanisms is sort of understood, but not that they are those 6 specific defense mechanisms that Freud identified, and everyone does at least one of those necessarily. But the idea that we have ways to sort of protect ourselves and lower our anxiety and cope with anxiety, that's pretty widely defended. And then terror management theory. This has to do with death-related anxiety, and it explores people's emotional and behavioral responses to reminders that they're going to die at some point, reminders of their impending death. And research on this theory shows that when you think about your own mortality, so you think about the fact that you'll eventually die, this provokes various terror management defenses. So ways that, again, we were kind of talking about defense mechanisms and lowering anxiety. Terror management theory is how do we manage the terror that we feel when we think about how we're going to die one day? How do we cope with that anxiety? What are our terror management defenses, our ways to lower that anxiety? Okay, moving on to sort of some more fun theories. Humanistic has to do with healthy personal growth. We were kind of talking about like positive psychology and humanistic psychology and all of that being about human flourishing, growing and flourishing. And so starting here with Maslow. Now, if we would have read all of chapter 11, you would have already been introduced to Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, but we skipped over those motivational theories in chapter 11, so I'm going to have to show it to you separately. But this is the hierarchy of needs that Maslow identified. And the idea is this: we start here at the bottom. We've got to meet these most basic needs first, and then as soon as those needs are met, we can move up to the next ones and the next ones and the next ones and the next ones. So down here at the bottom are your physiological needs. First, your most basic survival needs have got to be met. So you need air, food, water, sleep, and shelter, right? And then after that, you have needs for safety and security. So feeling free of fear, secure and comfortable in your body, your birthplace, your resources, things like that. So just not being fearful of impending danger or an inability to survive with the things that you need. And then we've got social needs, love and belongingness, self-esteem, and then self-actualization is kind of just about reaching your full potential and being the best that you can be. And then self-transcendence has to do with your connection with the divine, kind of, or your connection with the universe, the things that extend beyond yourself. So self-actualization is how do I become the best version of me that I can be? And then self-transcendence is, okay, now looking outside of me, how do I connect with all of sort of the wonders of the universe, right? And most people, kind of don't even reach self-transcendence a lot of the time. We sort of struggle a lot with these love and belongingness, self-esteem, and fulfillment issues. And a lot of people kind of get stuck right around there. And so kind of the two main ones that are most important here when it comes to personality development are those last two, self-actualization and self-transcendence. So like I said, self-actualization, fulfilling your potential, being the best you can be, whereas self-transcendence is looking beyond yourself, transcending above your physical self. Carl Rogers had this person-centered perspective. It's just the idea that people are basically good and they have self-actualizing tendencies. People are striving to be the best that they can be. I don't know if that's true, because I think that some people may just very well be evil, and that's how we get horrible violent crime. But nonetheless, this was Rogers' idea, is that people are basically good and they want to be the best they can be, and so we got to help them promote that growth, right? And so there are three components of Rogers' growth promoting social climate. And again, anytime we have a group of three, you should pay attention, right? Because she could say which of the following was not part of Rogers' growth promoting idea. And so the first is acceptance. We're going to accept the person that's coming in. And along with that comes this idea of unconditional positive regard. And that's just a caring and accepting, non-judgmental attitude. And so this is really just how you foster that bond between the client and the therapist and show them that you're accepting them. And then to be genuine, so being open with your own feelings, transparent and self-disclosing, and being empathetic towards the client as well. So these were Rogers' three kind of keystones in training therapists. You have to show acceptance, you have to be genuine, you have to be empathetic. Okay. So self-concept has to do with, your concept of yourself, all your thoughts and feelings about yourself. And there is this idea of a positive self-concept versus a negative self-concept. So it really has to do with looking at your actual self and your ideal self. So my actual self is where I actually am in reality, where my life is at in the present moment, in the life that I'm living. Whereas my ideal self is where I would like to be in my life at this point. And so the idea is this, and I want you to write this down. A positive self-concept is when your ideal self matches your actual self. Your ideal self and your actual self are very close or the same to one another. But you get a negative self-concept when your ideal self and your actual self do not match up. Okay, so negative self-concept, actual self and ideal self do not match. Positive self-concept, actual self and ideal self do match. And this makes sense, right? Because if you are living the life that you want to be living, if your actual self is the same as your ideal self, you're going to be pretty happy, right? You're going to be feeling pretty good about yourself. You're going to have a positive self-concept. And vice versa with negative. Okay. And so evaluating these theories, again, anytime you see humanistic, think like human flourishing, right? And like becoming the best you can be. Just insane positivity, right? So some criticisms and kind of their influence on psychology. So Maslow and Rogers did heavily influence counseling, education, child raising, management, and the branch positive psychology. But critics objected to Rogers' emphasis on individualism because they believed it could lead to self-indulgence, selfishness, and a lack of moral restraint, which is sort of the opposite of what we want if we're looking for sort of being the best that you can be and this whole self-actualization type idea. If we're instead tipping over into self-indulgence, selfishness, and a lack of moral restraint, this is an issue, right? And then another accusation is that humanistic psychology is naive in that it fails to appreciate the reality of the human capacity for evil because it's sort of too optimistic and says people are basically good and, they want to self-actualize. And we haven't necessarily seen evidence for that throughout history, right? So humanistic psychology is necessarily hopeful and optimistic, but it fails to be realistic about people. Okay, so then we're going to talk about traits. And so a trait is sort of just a pattern of behavior or a disposition to feel and act a certain kind of way. And traits are really what we're looking at anytime you take a personality test. So factor analysis can be a difficult concept for people some of the time. But factor analysis is going to identify clusters of items that fall together. So let's work backwards for a moment. And then we'll work forwards. So if I'm looking for extroversion in a person, what might show extroversion? Think about that for a second. Well, maybe a person's talkative. Maybe a person likes to go to parties often, right? Maybe a person prefers to work in a busy environment instead of quietly in a room or an office, right? So all these sorts of things, these are all, individual items that cluster together into the factor of extroversion. And so when you're giving a personality test, that's the idea here is, if we're asking all these different questions, do people answer some of these questions in the same way, if they are a certain type of way? And so let's say that a person said that they're organized and they're a perfectionist and they're always on time to everything, right? So these are all individual items, but the cluster or the factor is conscientiousness. And we're going to talk about sort of the big 5 traits. But at the end of the day, those big 5 traits are factors. They've been factor analyzed. We've picked apart all these little individual components of a test, and we figured out which things go together. right? So maybe being organized often pairs with being on time, right? Everyone who indicates that they're organized is also on time. And everyone who indicates that they're disorganized is also someone who indicates that they're not on time. So when this happens frequently, over and over with people, that people have the same answer on different types of questions, those questions can often become a factor. They're communicating the same underlying item, conscientiousness or extroversion or what have you. For example, people who describe themselves as outgoing say they like excitement and practical jokes and that they dislike reading. So this is a cluster of behaviors that reflects a basic factor or trait, which is extroversion. Some brain studies indicate that extroverts seek stimulation because their normal brain arousal is relatively low. This is actually something that you should pay attention to. This is something that is frequently asked about on tests. So the idea is that extroverts need extra stimulation from outside because their normal brain arousal is low compared to introverts who have a high brain arousal, and so they don't need to go out searching for more energy and stimulation from others. That's the idea. And then a frontal lobe area involved in behavior inhibition is less active in extroverts than introverts. Next to this, I want you to write down behavior inhibition equals self-control. Behavior inhibition equals self-control. Remember that inhibition, to inhibit something, is sort of to pull back or to control it, to stop it, right? And so inhibiting our behavior has to do with self-control, limiting sort of the actions of our id, really. And then people with a reactive autonomic nervous system react to stress with greater anxiety and inhibition. A personality inventory is a questionnaire that has items that indicate personality traits. And then just know that the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, is the most commonly given personality inventory, most commonly used. And then an empirically derived test is a test that is developed by testing some pool of items and selecting those that discriminate between groups. So we ask every question we can possibly ask, and then if we see that a few of those questions, the answers are just totally random, they don't seem to correlate with anything else in the test, we just delete that question altogether, and that's how we empirically derive a test. We only keep the questions that actually indicate something relevant, and we get rid of the rest. Okay, you just need to know what the big 5 factors are. You can use the acronym CANOE or OCEAN to remember them. C has to do with conscientiousness, and so that really is just about being organized, methodic, thorough, perfectionist, sort of things like that. Agreeableness has to do with being kind, affectionate, and sympathetic. How agreeable, how warm and kind and supportive of others are you? Neuroticism has to do with how emotionally unstable you are. So if you are a highly neurotic person, you get mood swings like crazy. You up and down, right? So neuroticism has to do with emotional stability or instability. And then openness is basically like openness to experience. How willing are you to try new things? How many different interests you have? And then extroversion, of course, being energetic, talkative, assertive, wanting or craving interaction with other human beings. Oh, also I should mention, the one that people miss the most is conscientiousness. So make sure that you know that it's conscientiousness and not any other word that starts with a C, because sometimes she'll just ask you to identify which of them is a big 5 trait. And so you might get 4 options that all start with a C, right? And you have to pick out conscientiousness. How stable are these traits? Conscientiousness and agreeableness increase with age. Neuroticism decreases with age. They're about 40% heritable per trait. The size and thickness of brain tissue correlates with the big 5. That's kind of cool. Especially conscientiousness is a frontal lobe factor. More conscientious people, no way, more conscientious people tend to have a larger frontal lobe area. It's always fun when I say things before I even see them. We have failed to find any association between birth order and personality. And so by birth order, we mean, does the oldest sibling have a characteristically different personality type than the youngest sibling? And we have not found a correlation between birth order and personality. They reasonably apply to basically all cultures, or many of them. Features of personality traits are common to all human groups. And then, do they predict our actual behaviors? Well, yes and no. They can predict certain behaviors up to a certain extent. But behavior is so complicated. There are so many things that go into whether or not we will actually do something that are so much more important than just any one given personality trait that we might have, because it has to do with the situation, the circumstances, how we were raised, our friends, what interests we have, what risks there may be, right? So we can predict certain behaviors up to a certain extent, but behavior is just influenced by so many different things. Okay, so evaluating the big five trait theory, essentially. We've got the person-situation controversy. So traits are both stable and strong, but behaviors, like I said, vary from situation to situation. So traits are dispositional, behaviors are situational. Personality test scores are weak predictors of behaviors. So like I said, there's so much more that goes into behavior than just a test score. Our personality traits are expressed in our music preferences, written communications, and online and personal spaces. People differ in how expressive they are characteristically. So, some people are very animated and very expressive, right? And other people are much more inhibited. And so when we asked people to act as expressive or as inhibited as possible when they were stating their opinions, people who are typically inexpressive but were trying to be expressive were not as expressive as the naturally expressive people. And then the other way around, if you were expressive and trying to be inhibited, you still couldn't manage to be as inhibited as an inhibited person who is acting naturally. So the main point here is that it's hard to be someone you're not, and it's hard to not be who you are as well. Okay, the social cognitive perspective. So right here immediately, the first thing that I want you to write down is that the social cognitive approach emphasizes that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Social cognitive approach emphasizes that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Okay. So, keeping that in mind, let's talk about some of these concepts. So, social cognitive is all about taking the social environment and linking it to people's thinking, right? People's mental processes. Reciprocal determinism just describes that behavior, internal cognition, and environment interact with each other. So really the best way to talk about this is with an example. Your past romantic experience, which would have been a behavior, influences your romantic attitudes or your internal cognition, which affects how you now respond to a new partner, your environment. So you can see how these three things, behavior, internal cognition, and environment, all interact to affect your behavior, your current behavior, your future behavior. And then there's three ways in which individuals and environments interact. Different people choose different environments. So your parents kind of choose the school that you attend in high school, but we chose the college that we decided to go to. We choose what we want to read, what movies we want to watch, what music we want to listen to, what friends we want to associate with. These are all environments, but they're environments that we have chosen to be a part of. Next, our personalities shape how we interpret and react to events. So anxious people tend to react more strongly than others to relationship threats. And that's kind of just that... we talked about sort of hypersensitivity to cues. When you have something that's happened to you before, you have some kind of anxiety surrounding something. And then lastly, our personalities help to create the situations to which we react. So the way we view and treat others, for example, influences how they're going to treat us. And that's called an evocation in personality theory. How do we evoke different behaviors out of others? What do we trigger from other people? And at every moment, our behavior is influenced by biology, social and cultural experiences, and our cognition and dispositions. So that kind of, biopsychosocial thing we've talked about for the whole year. Okay. So assessing behavior in situations, instead of paper and pencil tests, Army psychologists are subjecting candidates to simulated undercover conditions, and that is going to help predict later success on actual missions, or it has been shown to predict that success. So again, like I said, social cognitive theory has everything to do with emphasizing that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, which is why we do things like simulate situations that they could be in, because your behavior in that simulation is the best predictor to a social cognitive psychologist of your future behavior in a similar situation. Military and educational organizations and Fortune 500 companies have adopted assessment center strategies. Most American cities with 50,000 population or higher have used assessment centers to evaluate police officers and firefighters. So we have a practical use as well for these sort of simulated experiences. And the best means of predicting behavior is not a personality test or an interviewer's intuition. The best predictor of future behavior is the person's past behavior in similar situations. So if you can't check the person's past behavior, the next best thing is to create an assessment situation that simulates the task so you can see how the person would handle it. And then evaluating these theories, critics basically just say that social cognitive theories focus so much on the situation that they actually fail to appreciate the person's inner traits. And different people can react to the same situation very differently. So essentially, trait theory is too dispositional and not situational enough, but social cognitive theory is too situational and not dispositional enough. That's really the argument. Almost there. I know this is a long one. Okay, the self is just kind of that little person that runs around in your brain and organizes all the information, right? It's sort of that little inner being, essentially, that is assumed to be the center of your personality. And the self is something that is the most vigorously researched topic in Western psychology, one of them. Every year we have hundreds of studies on self-esteem, self-disclosure, self-awareness, self-schemas, self-monitoring, etc., right? The spotlight effect is overestimating others noticing and evaluating something about us, appearance, performance, blunders. So when you walk in late to a class, you probably feel like everyone's looking at you, right? You're like, oh my gosh, everyone's going to be like this lazy person who doesn't care to show up to class on time or something like that, right? But realistically, they're too focused on what they're doing to even notice you most of the time. How often do you notice other people walking into your class late, and how much attention does it really draw of yours, right? And so because we don't really notice those things in other people, they don't notice them in us either, but we have this spotlight effect where we are hypersensitive to paying attention to things that other people could interpret about us. So we actually stand out less than we think we do. It's kind of the main point. Self-esteem has to do with your feelings of worth. Self-efficacy has to do with your feelings of competence and effectiveness. These are very different. So self-esteem kind of has to do with your worth in your life, whereas self-efficacy has to do with competence in work or really just within your life too. So again, worth versus competence or effectiveness. People who feel good about themselves sleep better, are more positive. They're less likely to succumb to pressure. They're more persistent, feel less shy, anxious, and lonely, and they're happier overall. So self-esteem has some large benefits. But there could be some costs to self-esteem. So let's talk about those. The first is excessive optimism. If we are excessively optimistic, this can blind us to actual threats and risks that are around. And if we're overconfident in our ability to control some kind of impulse like smoking, we're more likely to expose ourselves to temptations and fail, right? So if you think, oh, if I just smoke once, it's not a big deal, and then you smoke once, well, then the next time it's even less of a bigger deal, right? And each time that you smoke after that, it's even less of a big deal to you. So that's kind of the idea. Blindness to your own incompetence. So people are often most overconfident when they are most incompetent. That's kind of funny. And that's the Dunning-Kruger effect, being ignorant of your own incompetence. Our ignorance of what we don't know sustains our self-confidence, which leads us to make confident mistakes, right? Okay, and then self-serving bias. I want you to write down that everybody has a self-serving bias. Every single person has a self-serving bias. And that's just a readiness to perceive yourself favorably, especially when you compare your behavior to someone else's behavior and you realize that you're making different attributions, right? So if you're late to class, your self-serving bias is going to say something like, well, I had so much homework that these teachers gave me that I had to stay up so late that of course I didn't wake up in the morning. It's not my fault, it's theirs, right? Self-serving bias. But, your friend comes into class a few minutes late and they're like, oh my gosh, I had so much to do last night. And you're like, yeah, right, you're just lazy, right? So that's kind of an example of self-serving bias. It's just a bias towards an interpretation that serves yourself, right? An interpretation that makes yourself feel better. So again, write down that everybody has a self-serving bias. People accept more responsibility for good deeds than they do for bad, and for successes than for failures. They're present worldwide, but they're weaker within collectivist cultures. And then narcissism is this excessive self-love and self-absorption. Conceited, self-important individuals turn nasty towards people who puncture their bubbles of self-love, so they do not take criticism well. And there's a correlation between narcissism and aggression. And so, final question, and then we're done. If self-serving bias is so prevalent, why is it that sometimes people disparage themselves? Why is it that sometimes people say, I'm not good at all, or I look so fat in this, or, whatever, right? So if we all have this self-serving bias, why do people disparage themselves? Well, could be because it's subtly strategic to elicit compliments from others. I look so fat in this. No, you don't. You're so skinny. I love your body, right? Kind of like that. Self-disparaging comments can prepare us for possible failure. So you can actually look at it as sort of a defense mechanism where if I'm negative from the start, then it can't possibly get any worse. I could only be pleasantly surprised, right? Self-disparagement helps us to learn from our mistakes. So when you do something bad and you're like, oh my gosh, I really messed that up, right? That's going to help you to learn from your mistakes. And then lastly, self-disparagement frequently pertains to one's old self. So when people are self-disparaging, way more frequently than not, they're talking about an old version of their self. They're not talking about who they currently are, right? And that's the end. So make sure to turn this in and take the quiz on Canvas. I know this was a little longer than usual, so thanks for sticking through it, and I'll see you next time.